Hey, so gamers, I lost my Wii Motion Plus, and it'll be a little bit of a hassle to get another one because, pandemic. So we're just going to skip the Skyward Sword video for now. I wasn't too disappointed about not being able to play it though, because it meant I could go directly to one of my favorite games in the series. Breath of the Wild is beautiful, unique, complex, expansive, cool. I'm running out of words, but it's good, alright? Is it flawless? Of course not. No game is, but Breath of the Wild is the closest the series has come so far. Let's talk about why. One of the most striking aspects of Breath of the Wild's design is the freedom it allows the player. Breath of the Wild is possibly the most open-ended the series has ever been. After the first hour or so, when you get off the tutorial area, the game doesn't tell you where to go. It suggests you go to Kakariko Village, and most players probably will, but from this point forward, you're completely free. You can go anywhere on the map, including directly to the final boss, and if you're skilled enough, you can defeat him. There are no traditional items to block progression, and the closest thing that the game has to dungeons, the Divine Beasts, can be done in any order, or not at all. The game just throws you into this massive sandbox and leaves you unsupervised. You have a wealth of options when it comes to getting around. You can just walk along a path or something, if you're lame and don't like having fun. Or you can climb the nearest mountain and glide until you reach the next mountain to climb. The climbing and gliding mechanics are awesome. You can climb almost everything as long as you have enough stamina, or enough stamina restoration items, or in a lot of cases just proper routing. And once you've reached the top of whatever you were climbing, you can glide back down, sometimes along the path you were planning to take, but most of the time you'll see something cool off to the side and end up gliding over there instead. Arguably the core gameplay of Breath of the Wild is just running around the world, seeing if there's something cool to find over there, and guess what? There is. The world is densely packed, and everywhere has at least something to find. The game has 120 shrines, essentially mini-dungeons, emphasis on the mini. Most of them introduce a basic puzzle concept. You solve a few variations on that concept, and good job, you're done. Have a spirit orb, essentially a heart piece. I like the shrines. They have fun puzzles, but they're incredibly brief. They're the equivalent of a room or two in a traditional Zelda dungeon. They're very approachable because you'll be spending like 5 minutes in each. Beyond shrines, there are also Koroks, arguably the main collectible. How many Koroks are there? Oh yeah, 900. Well, at least you don't need to find all of them. How many do you need to max out your inventory? 441? Huh. Koroks are frustrating. They're all over the world, and you'll probably find 50 to 100 of them just by walking around, but they're a completionist's nightmare. On an earlier playthrough, when I naively thought I'd try to 100% the game, even after 100 hours, I'd only found just over 300 Koroks. They aren't useless collectibles, however, as they can be used to expand your weapon, bow, and shield inventories. The good news is that you don't really need to max these out. On my most recent playthrough, I expanded my weapon inventory a few times, and was completely set. While the fact that I'll never be able to find all 900 Koroks will haunt me for the rest of my days, I do still prefer them to Gold Skulltula or Pose. So, those of you who haven't played Breath of the Wild might be a little confused that I was talking about weapon inventories. Let's talk about one of the most criticized aspects of Breath of the Wild, the weapon system. Every single weapon is breakable, even the Master Sword, though that's unique because it'll just recharge after a few minutes and repair itself. What Breath of the Wild wants you to do is break your weapons while fighting a group of enemies, and take theirs after you defeat them. Over time, you'll find rarer, stronger weapons that you'll likely want to save for harder enemies or boss fights. Eventually, with enough exploration, your inventory should be mostly filled by these stronger weapons, with a slot or two for the more disposable ones. And you know what? This system works well. It adds just a little more decision-making to combat, which the Zelda series desperately needed. Is it perfect? No. Personally, I hate inventory management. I find it incredibly frustrating. But that being said, the weapon system isn't as big an issue as some of Breath of the Wild's critics make it seem. It can feel annoying if, like me, you don't like inventory management, but it's not this huge issue that'll constantly be ruining the experience. It should be criticized, but it shouldn't be blown out of proportion. In the same vein, we need to touch on the combat. This is another often criticized aspect of Breath of the Wild, and again, it is flawed, but it's still the best combat system of the 3D Zelda games by a significant margin. In essentially every other 3D Zelda game, combat consists almost entirely of running up to an enemy or a group of enemies and hitting B a bunch of times. Maybe sometimes you'll choose to block, maybe sometimes you'll use an item, but those are only necessary in rare cases. The majority of combat is incredibly mindless, and admittedly, once you get further into Breath of the Wild, you can play the same way. Once you have enough hearts that you can survive a hit, you can simply pause and eat a bunch of apples or other healing items with absolutely no risk and no penalty. It's back to the same old, but it doesn't have to be. Where Breath of the Wild's combat rises above other games in the series is in the number of options it gives the player. You can run in and try to tank all the hits, or you can try to sneakily take out enemies from a distance using projectiles, or you could wait for nightfall and take them out while they're sleeping, or you can pick up a metal box and flail it around to do simply ridiculous amounts of damage, or you can push a boulder onto them if there's one nearby, etc. There are also two new mechanics, perfect dodges and perfect parries. While I'm sure they can be effective against normal enemies, I never bothered to use them. I did, however, use them extensively against harder enemies and bosses. Perfect dodges are the most consistent way to take down a Lynel by far, and you can use perfect parries to reflect Guardian Blasts. Both of these techniques are very consistent with just a little practice, but they're still satisfying. I may not have used these techniques very often, but I did feel cool whenever I did get the opportunity, and I'd still much rather have the option to use them than go back to the overly simplified combat of other Zelda games. As far as main content goes, which I'm really just defining as the Divine Beasts, it's something. The things you have to do before boarding the beasts are often pretty boring and tedious. The best was definitely before Vah Ruta, where you're supposed to sneak around and snag some shock arrows without alerting the Lynel, yet you can also just take it on, and considering I always go to Zora's Domain first, it's an exciting fight, and incredibly satisfying when you do overcome the Lynel. That's fun. The others, not so much. Boarding the beasts is almost always exciting, not you. These sequences are cinematic, though they aren't really that challenging. And then the beasts themselves are brief but cool. They're incredibly small when compared to dungeons in other Zelda games, and they all took about 20 minutes each. You can also always move some part of the beast, or the entire beast, through the dungeon map, kind of like Stone Tower Temple. I always think stuff like that is cool, but the Divine Beasts were so short that these mechanics didn't really get developed. People who play Zelda games for the dungeons will be sorely disappointed by what Breath of the Wild has to offer. Luckily, I'm not one of those people. I greatly prefer the Divine Beasts to traditional dungeons. Breath of the Wild knew its dungeons weren't the main event, so they're over pretty quickly, and I appreciate that. As far as presentation goes, it's alright. I like the art style. I don't love it, but I don't hate it either. It's pleasant. The ancient technology is very unique aesthetically. It looks like nothing else in the series, very fitting for the alien feel of the Guardians. The visuals are overall pretty good, but then there's the music. Similar to Twilight Princess, the music in Breath of the Wild fits the atmosphere well, but unlike the former, the music often feels non-existent. Exploration is accompanied by infrequent, gentle piano notes, and I can't stress this enough, it fits the atmosphere incredibly well. But I can't help but be a little disappointed that we didn't get a strong overworld theme like in the previous games. The music makes exploring Hyrule feel less like an adventure and more like a pleasant walk through nature, which isn't inherently bad, but can be a letdown for people such as myself, who were expecting to hear something like the epic soundtrack of other Zelda games. But that's definitely not to say there's none of that kind of music. In fact, some of my favorite tracks in the entire series are from this game. I'm looking at you, Hyrule Castle, but it's a shame these songs aren't what you'll be hearing for the majority of the experience. Finally, let's talk about the story. It doesn't really exist. Because the game offers so much freedom, and it can't be sure what a player will see, it can't really create a true narrative like in other Zelda games. I guess what you would call the main story would be rescuing the spirits of the champions from the Divine Beasts, but each character gets only a few cutscenes to be developed, so I really just didn't care about them. You can also call the memories you can collect the main story, but these are just some brief cutscenes that'll smack you in the face with the idea that Zelda is upset because she can't awaken her powers. This is her one character trait. I'm not going to say that other Zelda games have compelling stories necessarily, but they do at least have some narrative, with stakes and growth and plot points. Breath of the Wild doesn't really have any of these, but it still pretends it does. As I said in the beginning of the video, Breath of the Wild is not flawless, but it is still a great game. It may not be like the previous games in the series, but for what it sets out to do, it does very well. I highly recommend any person who enjoys the exploration aspect of Zelda games, or open world games, plays Breath of the Wild. I've poured about 150 hours into it overall, and though it's not as focused as other Zelda games, I'd still call it among the best in the series. Solid S tier.